If you're a non-farmer, one of the things you may occasionally hear farmers and ranchers talk about is rotational grazing of livestock. We want to explain today what that is and why farmers and ranchers would do that.
Well, having a grass pasture just seems so easy from the outside. It's like, well, hey, you've got cattle. They like to eat grass, so you just turn them out on the pasture and forget about it, right?
Right, piece of cake.
It's not quite that simple.
Well, it can be that simple, but the whole thing is, we look at, as agronomists and farmers, we look at that grass as our crop. And the idea is we're trying to raise as much of that crop as possible, because if we can raise more crop on the same number of acres, we can feed more livestock, and then in the end, we can produce more food for our growing world. So how do we get smart about this and produce the most grass? Well, obviously we've got to do soil testing and take care of drainage, fertilize right, control the weeds, all that type of thing. But this rotational grazing thing is something that's gotten really popular here in just the last 10 years. And there are a couple of main reasons why farmers and ranchers look at this. Number one is weed control, and it really has to do with the overall crop canopy, so we'll talk about that. And then the other thing is just ending up with more total grass production by moving the cattle around to different areas of that pasture on a regular basis.
I'm going to talk about that one because getting more grass to grow in the same size pasture, so we're talking about the same piece of ground here, just getting more grass production, it could be as simple as giving that grass more time to recover after it's been fed on. So think about it this way. If you've got a big pasture and you let the cattle just graze wherever they want to, well, they might have some areas that they hit pretty hard. Well, how hard is it for that grass to recover? It's pretty tough, especially when you've got cattle walking on top of you all the time. But if we divide that pasture up into multiple sections, now we can focus the cattle on one little area of the pasture. We leave them there for a certain amount of time, maybe it's a week, and then we move them to the next area of the pasture. Now, let's just say that you had that pasture in 4 sections. Well, now you've got several weeks for that pasture to regrow. And now you've got grass,
or at least several days.
Yeah, you got grass that's up, a foot tall or maybe even taller, depending on what you have for weather during that time period. Well, you've got healthy grass. It chokes out the weeds. The cattle love it. They don't have to eat thistles and other things that may grow up opportunistically when you've over-mowed or overgrazed that grass.
Okay, Darren mentioned weeds. I mentioned weeds earlier, and I just want to explain this a little bit more. Crop canopy is the very best weed killer there is. I realize we're the weed of the week guys, and we're always talking to you about, hey, control this weed, a lot of times with herbicide or tillage or something like that. But one of the things we always say is if we can get a great crop growing, that will literally choke out the weeds. It won't allow sunlight to get down to the ground, and it does compete well with weeds. Well, the problem is if that grass gets so short and it's not allowed to choke out the weeds, there are some weeds that do get started in that pasture. That's a bad thing because the weeds rob moisture, they rob nutrients, they rob overall tonnage of the grass. And so what I'm saying here is without even using a herbicide, just a cultural practice, we can absolutely have more grass in our pastures with this rotational grazing that we're talking about. And that, to me, I think is the biggest thing and the biggest reason why we're seeing more overall grass production with farmers and ranchers who use rotational grazing versus those who don't.
Rotational grazing is a great practice that can help improve grass growth out in pastures, and that's desirable grass species. If we've got undesirable grass species, we call them weeds, and if we see this particular weed in our fields, we get really concerned. We'll show you how to stop this tough weed later in the show.